بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وتبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد. أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ووهبنا لداود سليمان نعم العبد إنه أواب. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To continue our discussions looking at the stories of the prophets of Islam, last week we concluded the story of Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, and we introduced his son Nabi Sulaiman. And of course, if you remember the series of events, we began with the discussions of Nabi Samuel, Ishmael, and then after him we spoke about Talut, and then after him we spoke about Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, and now we speak about Nabi Sulaiman. They say that Nabi Sulaiman inherited from his father, as the Holy Quran explains. وَوَرِثَ Sulaiman Dawood, that Sulaiman inherited from his father. What exactly did he inherit? He inherited everything that his father had. His father was a king, so he inherited all of the material possessions that a king would normally have. There were 1,000 steeds that he inherited from his father, many lands, the palace, the throne. Sulaiman inherited anything that his father owned. Beyond that, they say that no, because Sulaiman was a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are certain things that he inherited from the previous prophet as well. He inherited the knowledge that his father had. He inherited the khilafah that his father had. He inherited the wisdom, he inherited the wilayah that his father had. You find, for example, in the ayat of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it clear that we provided ilm to whom? To Dawood and his son Sulaiman. And because they were given ilm, they used to say that Allah has given us certain fadl, certain merits, much more than what he has given to the other mu'mineen in their respective times. So you find that Nabi Dawood alayhi salam, not only did he pass on physical objects and material aspects of dunya to his son, but also the authority of wilayah, the authority of khilafah, and the authority of prophethood as well. So Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam now officially becomes the prophet of his time. And at the same time, he becomes the king of his time as well. When we in Ziyarat Waritha mention Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, we constantly refer to him as what? Warithatul Anbiya, yes? Assalamu alayka ya waritha Nuhin Nabiyallah, Adam Sifwatillah. Meaning that he inherited from all of these different prophets. The idea which has been reaffirmed by the authority and the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt is that when one prophet passes away, that authority is then inherited by the successor. In this case, Sulaiman inherits from his father, Nabi Dawood alayhi salam. Now the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces Sulaiman with the most profound of words. But unfortunately, you realize that when you go deep into the examination of the life of Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, Sulaiman is one of those prophets. He has a presence in the Jewish scriptures, he has a presence within the Christian scriptures, and of course within the Quran as well. He's one of those prophets that the Jews speak about, that the Christians speak about, Solomon, and of course the Muslims speak about as well. And what happens is that many a times, a lot of aspects of his life are spoken of which somehow defames him, somehow vilifies him in one way or another. When you refer to the Bible, for example, they say that Sulaiman was a man of power, but at the same time, the powers and his pleasures got the best of him many a times, and he committed certain sins and he made certain mistakes. Likewise in the Torah, likewise in the Talmud, you find that there are negative aspects mentioned of when it comes to Sulaiman alayhi salam. Whereas the Quran, when Allah introduces him, He says, "Innahu awwab," that he was a man of God, he was a man of spirituality, the best in his time. When the Quran speaks about the prophets of Allah, they are presented, they are identified as uswatun hasana, that they are role models, they are archetypes for the people of their time. If people wanted to get closer to Allah, they would refer to the prophets of Allah, meaning that the prophets had to be absolutely infallible, free from any error, any mistake. In fact, one of the reasons why we have many narrations, and we have many narrations that belittles the position of Nabi Sulaiman, and the reason why we have these narrations is because there were certain individuals, they came towards the religion of Islam, but they brought with them many aspects that they learned before in their previous religions, the likes of Ka'ab al-Ahbar. Ka'ab al-Ahbar, so he was a Jewish rabbi, he was a scholar from amongst the Jewish communities. Then he embraced the religion of Islam. When he came towards the religion of Islam, he began interpreting Islam using many aspects from Judaism. And therefore you found many prophets are now spoken of and they are vilified, or their status is brought down. One day a man came towards Imam Bakir alayhi salatu wassalam. He says, Ya ibn Rasulullah, we've heard a hadith from the Prophet of Allah when he says every single day the Kaaba in Masjid al-Haram performs sujood to Masjid al-Aqsa. The Imam alayhi salam, he says, where did you hear this from? He says, we heard it from Ka'ab al-Ahbar. The Imam says to him, you have lied, and so has Ka'ab al-Ahbar. Meaning we Muslims, we turn towards the Kaaba every day, and the Kaaba turns to Masjid al-Aqsa in sujood. How is this possible? The Imam alayhi salam, the narration says he displayed anger. It's very hard for an Imam of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. It's very difficult for the Prophet of Allah to display anger. But when the religion of Islam is attacked, they display anger. He says, you have lied as well as Ka'ab al-Ahbar. Amongst our scholars, Ka'ab al-Ahbar is seen as a kadhab, a person who is an open liar. But in fact, what's interesting is that this same personality is revered by our brothers, the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in his book, he mentions Ka'ab al-Ahbar as a thuqat, as a person who is absolutely trustworthy. Why is he a trustworthy source? They say the reason why he's a trustworthy source is because he used to be one of the confidants of Umar ibn Khattab. And because the scholars and the companions saw him to be a close confidant of Umar ibn Khattab, they began to take a hadith from him. And many of the books are filled with his narrations. At-Tabari, when he speaks about, for example, the previous kings and the Anbiya, many narrations come from Ka'ab al-Ahbar. Our scholars say that he is a man of deception. He is a man of lies. Any ahadith that comes from Ka'ab al-Ahbar should be thrown away, should not even be entertained, even for any aspects within Islamic history. So you found that when it comes to Nabi Sulaiman, you find that there are many narrations mentioned by Ka'ab al-Ahbar which belittles the position of Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. One of these incidences is mentioned within the Quran in Surah As-Sad. In Surah As-Sad, verse 33 onwards, Allah then begins to speak about the incidents regarding the life of Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. Allah says in verse number 31, إِذْ أُرِدَ عَلَيْهِ بِالْعَشِيِّ السَّافِنَاتُ الْجِيَادِ. They say one day Sulaiman, he was sitting in his throne and he was inspecting the horses. As he's inspecting the horses, and it was a very meticulous task that no one could do except for Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. So he's inspecting one horse after another, and there are thousands of horses. فَقَالَ إِنِّي أَحْبَبْتُ حُبُّ الْخَيْرِ عَنْ ذِكْرِ رَبِّي حَتَّى تَوَارَتْ بِالْحِجَابِ. He's inspecting the horses to such an extent that his mind moves away from the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when his mind moves away from the dhikr of Allah, all of a sudden the sun begins to set. When he sees that the sun is now setting, what does he say? He says, رُدُّوهَا عَلَيَّ. He says, let the sun come back. Now, The hadith, when it speaks about this particular incident, what does it say? It says that one day Sulaiman alayhi salam is inspecting the horses. As he's inspecting the horses, it's such a meticulous task that the sun begins to set. And then he says to himself, hold on a second, I haven't prayed. I was so busy in this task that I forgot my salah. Now remember, Nabi Sulaiman, just like his father Nabi Dawood, just like before him Talut, they used to follow the Sharia of Nabi Musa alayhi salam. Now part of the Sharia of Nabi Musa alayhi salam was that salah used to be recited at the time of Asr. So that salah, specific salah, just before ghurub, just before maghrib, he forgot to pray. And then he turns to Allah or the angels and he says, Rudduha alayya. Let the sun come back, prolong the day so I can engage in my salah. And of course, I can carry on with my day. Now, when you refer to our scholars, what's interesting is that some of our scholars entertain this idea. They say, no, it is possible for such a particular incident to take place. The likes of Allama Tabatabai, rahmatullah alayhi. Allama Tabatabai here says, he says, look, Nabi Sulaiman is the king of his time. He is the ruler of the empire. There's a threat coming from outside. Jihad is wajib, isn't it? Jihad to procure the safety of your lands and your empire, to establish prosperity and peace for your people is wajib. To fight against the threat is wajib. So he began inspecting all of the horses, getting them prepared for war, getting them prepared for battle. Because this was such a tedious and a meticulous task, he could not find time to take a break and to recite salah. He says here, Allama Tabatabai explains, he says, look, here on the one hand, jihad becomes wajib. Salah is wajib as well. So now you have two wajib responsibilities on your shoulders. Which one do you cater for? Which one do you prioritize? One or the other? So unfortunately you found, for example, in this area, Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam prioritized jihad over salah. So he tries to reconcile this particular reading. Other scholars, the likes of Sheikh Jaffer Subhani, he does not entertain this idea at all. And amongst our other mufassirin, contemporary mufassirin, they reject this idea completely. They say the position of salah within the religion of Islam is very well known. Within Islam today, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ. That the dhikr of Allah, salah specifically, one should recite salah when standing. If a person cannot stand, then he should recite it sitting. If a person cannot recite it sitting, عَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ, then he should recite it lying down. Meaning what? Meaning that salah should never be neglected by each and every one of us. It should never be neglected within our lives. So how is it possible for a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to realize the spirituality of salah, to prioritize jihad over salah? Out of all of the different wajibat, salah has to be prioritized. Within our sharia, we have something known as Salat al-Khawf. Salat al-Khawf was demonstrated beautifully by Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. In the Battle of Siffin, for example, in the heat of war, the Imam alayhi salam spent some time reciting Salat al-Khawf, Salah. Salat al-Khawf, the demonstration and the practice of Salat al-Khawf is such that you manage to recite your Salah in the most extenuating of circumstances, but the style is very different. Very quickly you recite your Salah and you get back into fighting and in the state of battle and war. Salah should never be neglected. A prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should realize this first and foremost before the mu'mineen. So here, Sheikh Jafar Subhani, on this level, he says that, look, on the one hand, Allah describes him as ni'mal abd, the most blessed of our servants. He is an abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salah is always his priority. Jihad will never take a priority over salah. But then he says that it's impossible for Allah to identify Sulaiman as ni'mal abd, and then for him later on to say that, there was a time in his life where he neglected his salah. Other evidences he uses, he says, look at these ayats of the Holy Quran. These ayats don't talk about the sun. They talk about the battle steeds. They talk about the horses. So from this, what we understand is that he was inspecting these horses. And then he says to himself, as he's inspecting these horses, that this is a beautiful power that Allah has given me. And this power is something that I use to perform the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not that it's taken me away from the dhikr of Allah, it is a manifestation of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to prepare for jihad, to prepare for war, to establish safety within the Muslim lands. He interprets the words of Sulaiman as being a form of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he says that when the horses began to leave and to go towards battle, it's not the sun that was setting, it was the battle steeds that were leaving until he could not see it anymore. So from this perspective, you realize that Sheikh Jaffer Subhani comes up with a different interpretation, and this is something that our current mufassirin accept as a whole. So from this, you find that the interpretations of the sun, that Sulaiman alayhi salam forgot to pray, all of this came from Ka'ab al-Ahbar. And of course our ulama say that he is one of the kadhabeen, that he is one of the liars. Then the verses of the Holy Quran begin to speak about another incident. Another incident which we referred to last week very briefly, allow us to go into much more detail. Very interesting incident. He says, the ayah of the Holy Quran says, وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّ سُلَيْمَانَ. And indeed we tried and we tested Sulaiman. What did we try? وَأَلْقَيْنَا عَلَى كُرْسِهِ جَسَدًا ثُمَّ أَنَابٍ. That we brought forth someone, a jasad, a body, onto his throne. And then he turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in repentance. The ayah after begins to say that Sulaiman turns to Allah and he says, قَالَ رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَحَبْ لِي مُلْكًا لَا يَنْبَغِي لِأَحَدٍ مِّن بَعْدِي إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْوَهَّابُ. He turns to Allah, he says, Ya Allah, I've made a mistake. Forgive me. Forgive me and give me a kingdom that will not be given to anyone after me. So the question that arises here is what happened in that particular incident. Now there are two narrations. One narration is laughable and absolutely rejected, and you wouldn't be surprised that it's mentioned by the likes of Ka'ab al-Ahbar. The second narration is a story. It's a lesson for each and every one of us. Something that we should apply within our daily lives. The first narration says that one day Sulaiman was given a ring by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This ring was known as the ring of power. Whenever Sulaiman wore this ring, insan, the jinn, the skies, the winds, the birds, the insects, everything would turn to him in obedience. But if he was to remove this ring, that obedience would be taken away from him. So one day he goes to the loo. When he goes to the loo, he gives this ring to his servant and he says, look after this ring, I'll be back. When he removes the ring, they say some of the shayateen came and they tricked this servant and they took the ring from him. When Sulaiman came out of the loo, he saw that his kingship, his kingdom has been taken away from him. The ring is no longer in his possession. So he leaves the palace and then he begins to go towards one particular place. He just begins to walk, he begins to travel. In the meantime, a shaitan takes his throne. The shaitan literally sits on his throne. He wears the ring. He disguises himself as Sulaiman and he begins to rule the kingdom. And this Quran that I have, the translation literally correlates with this particular interpretation. The translation here, it says, and indeed we tried Sulaiman. What did we try him with? We placed on his throne a devil. So he lost his kingdom for a while. Don't be surprised if you come across certain Sunni tafasir that entertain this particular translation, this particular tafsir. So Sulaiman begins to travel in one direction. The devil takes over his throne. But the people begin to realize, they say, hold on a second, this isn't Sulaiman. His behavior is different. They come towards his mother and they say, Sulaiman, he seems a bit different, doesn't he? His mother says, absolutely. Before he used to obey me, he used to obey my orders, but now he disobeys me. His mother comes towards some of his wives and they say to his wives, is Sulaiman different? They say, yes, absolutely. Sulaiman is very different behind closed doors. Before he was a man of respect, but now he's something else different, completely different. So they realize that this person is not Sulaiman, but it's someone else. The shaitan realized that people are now beginning to realize that he's not Sulaiman. So what does he do? He escapes. He takes off the ring, he throws it in the river, and he escapes. Sulaiman, one day he's traveling, he comes across a fisherman. The fisherman needs help. He tells Sulaiman, help me fish, and I'll pay you towards after the work is done. Sulaiman agrees. They go fishing, they catch a few fish. Sulaiman takes a few fish as payment. He cooks one of the fishes. He opens the belly of the fish. He finds his ring. He then wears the ring again, and the throne is given back to him. And then he turns to Allah and he seeks forgiveness for separating from that ring. This particular narration, we reject it completely. We shred it into pieces. It's laughable. Why? Because the kingdom, the authority, the power that was given to Sulaiman, that's power that's given to Sulaiman, not the ring. The ring is a representation of power. It's not power in itself. So, this particular narration is dejected. It's rejected in its absolute sense. Then you have a different narration. This other narration is something that has been entertained, and of course it's something that has been provided by the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. They say Sulaiman had everything in his hands. Sulaiman had the kingdom. He had material wealth. He had assets. You could not believe. The only thing that he did not have was children, a lineage. Now as a king, he wanted to expand his empire. And the most powerful thing he could think about was to have a lineage that would serve him in the expansion of his empire. So he would have sons, and he would delegate these sons to look after certain areas of his empire. And that's how he would expand. So Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam, he has some wives. He spends some time with his wives. One of his wives becomes pregnant. When she becomes pregnant, Sulaiman is now looking forward to the birth of his child. On the day of the birth of the child, she delivers a child. She delivers a boy. But unfortunately, you find that it was a stillborn delivery. The child enters this dunya as a mayyit. They came to Sulaiman. They entered his throne, his courtroom. They came towards his throne and they placed the infant mate on his throne. When he came back, and as he was approaching his throne, he saw the deceased child. And it was a very emotional moment for him to lose a child, especially yearning for one for such a long time. It was a very difficult emotional moment for him. He begins to cry and he sheds tears. Losing a son is one of the greatest imtihan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's one of the greatest tests of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon his abd. The likes of Ibrahim alayhi salam, especially Ibrahim, towards the end or the final years of his life, Allah grants him sons. When he is asked to sacrifice Ismail, it tears him into pieces. But he follows and obeys the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person who loses a son is a test from Allah, but then at the same time, he has to realize that there is wisdom from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the most powerful ways to ascend the higher echelons of spirituality is to submit to the authority and the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what exactly Sulaiman does. He follows the orders of Allah. He understands the wisdom of Allah. He turns to Allah. He begins to dissect his movement. He begins to dissect all of the decisions that he made. Where did he go wrong in his decisions? Then he realized, and the narrations speak of this, they say that Sulaiman began to plan way ahead. He began to plan the future aspirations, his future aspirations and goals in the expansion of his empire. So much so that he did not say, Insha'Allah. He said, I have wives, I will impregnate them, they will give me a child, and this child I will nurture him, raise him, serve, give him knowledge so that he serves me in my kingdom, so that he engages in the expansion of my empire. But never did he think about Allah. Some narrations say that he did not think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some narrations say, no, he did think about Allah, but not the way Allah ought to be remembered. Is this a sin? Is this considered to be a sin? If I was to make decisions and not think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is this seen as a sin? No, it's not seen as a sin. It's not the best actions, but it's not recognized as a sin. But Nabi Sulaiman recognized it as a sin. And he treated it as a sin. Therefore he turns to Allah. He says, قَالَ رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي, forgive me for my shortcomings. The ulama here come and explain, they say that the actions and the worldview of the Anbiya is different to our approach to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In which way? There are certain actions that we can perform in our lives. They will not be considered to be sins. But if the Anbiya and the Awliya and the Muqarrabin were to observe our actions, they would recognize it and treat it as sins. I'll give you an example. If I go home after delivering the Majlis and binge, if I binge on a particular TV show for hours, that's not seen as a sin. It could be halal, it's not seen as a sin. But if the Muqarrabin were to view my actions and observe my actions, they would say, well, you're wasting your time. And they treat such actions as sins. So the Anbiya, at times, they would view certain actions as sins when in reality it's not considered to be sins. And one of them is that he never thought of Allah, or he thought of Allah very little. The idea being is that we plan in our lives. We make all of these plans 5 years later, 10 years later. I will expand my business in this way or that way. Let me get married a few years later. Let me have children a few years later. We make all of these different plans in our lives, but we forget that Allah is in control of everything. Allah, when He saw Sulaiman planning ahead, how he was to expand his empire, He gives Sulaiman a son, but He gives him a dead son. Sulaiman realizes his mistake. He turns to Allah. He says, Ya Allah, forgive me for my shortcoming. What follows after is remarkable. He turns to Allah. He says, Ya Allah, give me a kingdom. This is after witnessing his son dead. He says, Ya Allah, give me a kingdom that no one is to have after me. Question, why does Sulaiman make such a dua? Why does Sulaiman make such a dua? One day a man came towards Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. Ali ibn al-Yaqtin came towards Imam Kadhim alayhi salam, and he said, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. He says, Yabna Rasulullah, was Sulaiman greedy? He says, no, absolutely not. He says, then why does he pray for a kingdom that should not be given to anyone after him? He says, kingship, authority, mulk can be attained in one of two ways. Either Allah gives it to you, or number two, through oppression. He says, Sulaiman turned to Allah and he said, Ya Allah, give me a kingdom that no one can attain through oppression. No matter how many kings that come in history that seek authority through oppression, it will never be equal to the kingdom of Sulaiman alayhi salam. But when it comes to the idea of Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif, and his Salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad, and the authority that will be given to him, it could be the likes of Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. It could be far greater than Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. Sulaiman's words here are interpreted as what? As a mulk that can never be attained through oppression. Number two, why does Sulaiman ask for a kingdom that no other can be given after him? The reason is because he wants to relay a message to the people that when mulk comes into the hands of a person, it behooves that that person is directly appointed by Allah. Because if mulk is given to a normal layman, who is not a prophet, who is not a ma'asum, then that authority will corrupt. And when there is corruption, there is fasad, and there is fitna, and there is oppression. And with it, there is crime, and there is poverty, and all of these different vices that we see within our community. But if kingship is given to a ma'asum, then they will see that the authority of Allah is seen and manifested in this earth. That can bring about prosperity, that can bring about peace. The greatest imtihan and the greatest dhulm that befell upon Ali Muhammad was that the kingship was taken away from them. The third reason as to why Sulaiman seeks a kingdom that no other should be given after him the likes of, is to show the people that however powerful he is a faqir in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because Allah is the one who is in charge of everything that He has in this world. It was a direct message to the people. Never become arrogant with what you have. Because everything stems from Him, Rabbul Alameen. When you therefore turn your minds towards Umar ibn Sa'd, Umar ibn Sa'ad is given a choice. He says, we will give you the kingship of Ray. All you have to do in return is slaughter Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. He comes back and he thinks to himself, he says, this is a very beautiful deal. I can slaughter Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam and I can seek istighfar and at the same time enter the kingdoms of heaven and at the same time be the ruler of Ray. When Karbala takes place, he comes back to his home. One of his friends, they come and they visit Umar ibn Sa'ad. Said, Ya Umar, are you okay? He says, don't ask me if I'm okay. I've come back as a dishonorable person. My family have abandoned me and they have cut off all relationship with me. He says, Ray was not given to me and I have perpetuated one of the greatest crimes in history. He says, I am the one who is responsible for the slaughter of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. On the day of Muharram, on the day of the 10th, he turns to his companions and he says to them, he says, witness that I was the first to trigger the arrow towards the camps of Abu Abdullah. In front of Ibn Ziyad, mention this so that I am rewarded. The crimes that he committed on the 10th of Muharram was not just the assassination of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam, but it was to vilify the sanctity of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. It was to demolish the sanctity of Ali Muhammad and the Ahlul Bayt. He ordered the body of Abu Abdullah to lay in the sands of Karbala. Then he turned towards 10 soldiers. He said to them, mount on your steeds and trample on the body of Abu Abdullah. When they came towards the body, when they came towards the sacred body, Zainab alayhi salam, she turns to Imam al-Sajjad. She says, Yabna Rasulallah, I hear the sounds of breaking and the sounds of cracking. What's that sound, Yabna Rasulallah? He replies, oh my aunt Zainab, that's the chest of my father under the hooves of the horses. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive the sins of our marhumeen. Tonight being the night of Laylatul Jum'ah, inshallah our du'as will reach them and it will benefit them in the afterlife. Surah Al-Fatiha for all our marhumeen.